How do you get a jacked brain? Your first symptom of Alzheimer's disease may begin in your 60s, but that has been starting in your late 20s, early 30s.
So we can essentially prevent ourselves from getting Alzheimer's.
This is the only disease that robs you of who you are. Your brain doesn't know the difference between you getting hit by a car or you going through a divorce or you just getting a bad notification from an ex.
Improving your VO2 max by 1 point improves your lifespan by 45 days.
That is correct, yeah.
Welcome back to the Rena Malik MD podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Rena Malik, urologist and pelvic surgeon. Today, our guest is Louisa Nicola, neurophysiologist and human performance coach, as well as director at Neuroathletics, where she coaches the world's elite athletes and high-performing individuals on how to optimize their brain for peak performance. Not only is she brilliant about the brain, but she also herself was an Olympic athlete doing triathlons for Australia. She is a true pleasure to have on today. We talked about how improving the quality of your brain can improve the quality of your life. What are the 5 things that you can do to improve brain health that are free and easily accessible? And how exercise can not only remodel your heart to work more effectively, but can also increase the volume of your brain, and how valuable that is in terms of improving your brain health. How can you stave off dementia? And what exactly is dementia? And we also talk about the importance of sleep, how to deal with jet lag, and what are some things you can do to optimize your nighttime routine so that you're getting to bed and sleeping at the same time every single night. And what are the 2 supplements that you should be taking for your brain? Louisa, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here.
This is such an important topic. And I often think about this and I'm like, everyone knows about heart health. They've got the best marketing team, right? Everyone knows what's good for your heart and you should exercise and eat right. But no one ever really talks about brain health in the same way, right? I think it's an afterthought. It's my grandpa's losing their thoughts, or they're having difficulty remembering things, it's getting a little troublesome, but they don't think about it when they're younger. I think that's a real issue. And I've heard you say that you can improve the quality of your life by improving the quality of your brain.
Correct.
So let's talk about why people should care about their brain.
Yeah, and that's a really, you've touched on something so important. Most people do only care about, cardiovascular disease, the number 1 killer in the world. So of course we need to be caring about it. I think this whole world of brain health is very elusive because even today we actually know more about space than we do about the brain, which is quite scary, right? We hear the word dementia, but still a lot of people are confused as to what it is. They can't differentiate between dementia, Alzheimer's disease, frontotemporal dementia. So we can talk about all of that. But we really need to be caring about the health of our brains because when you think about it, the human brain, it's about 2 pounds, and I would say it's got the consistency of hard jello, but it is responsible for absolutely everything we do, everything you are, everything you think, everything you produce, from your muscle actions to the people that you talk to the person you are married to, is ultimately determined by the quality of your brain. And when I think about brain health, I think about quality of the function of the brain. That's the neural networks and structures, which is the gray matter and the white matter of the brain. So the structural components and the functional components. And if we are not careful, we can end up going down this road that 55 million people currently go down right now in the world, and that is Alzheimer's disease. And that is a very scary state. And the one thing I do want to point out, first and foremost, is that my hypothesis, or not, if it's not even my hypothesis, it is what I believe to be true, and that is that dementia is not a normal part of aging. So we need to really redefine what that is, because a lot of people, you just said it, oh, my grandmother's losing, it's not a normal part of aging, but people think that it is, and we have the ability to change that. We have the ability to slow the progression of onset of dementia and Alzheimer's disease through lifestyle habits.
Yeah, and we're going to get into that, but you've said so many important things here. And I think one thing that people don't realize is that the quality of your life, including the people you marry and the people you surround yourself, are related to your brain health. Let's talk a little bit about, like, what does that mean? How does the brain change that for you?
We have these networks, these specialized networks. People hear about the prefrontal cortex, okay? It sits in the frontal lobe, right at the frontal pole of the brain, and it's where we house our executive functions. Think your information processing speed, your thinking, your decision making. These are all governed by the prefrontal cortex. We've also got other networks in our brain, and they can be molded through actions that we produce, through the people that we talk to, through this phenomenon called neuroplasticity. So literally, everything is information. That is what you are taking in: information from your phone, information from the people that you are talking to, information from your spouse. So when you get this information, your brain creates a network around it, and then it becomes stronger. So that information becomes stronger, it becomes more familiar. Your brain likes familiarity, right? It loves to loves regularity and what's familiar. It doesn't want to be shocked. So once it sees certain behaviors, you then mold into that. You start to think that this is normal. That's why I'm really careful with the people that I talk to. It's that old saying, like, you are the product of the top 5 people that you hang around.
Can your brain health affect your attraction to people? So, like, if you have a healthier brain, will you find yourself attracted to healthier people?
I mean, I think yes. I don't know the science behind that, but you would definitely think so if you are on that part. And that's also got to do with the endocrine system as well, the hormones that are produced that are signaling different things to your brain. But I really think it's a result of who and what the information is that you're giving your brain. It is very plastic. It has to be given the information.
So what is neuroplasticity?
It's the brain's ability to rewire itself through actions. So we've all heard of, we've got 87 billion neurons average in the human brain. They are nerve cells. They are our chief brain cell in the brain, and they communicate with each other, right? And they connect to one another. Each neuron has around 15 to 30,000 connections, which, if you do the math on that, it's a lot of energy happening in the brain. Mm-hmm. And it is thought that if you produce a certain action or you think a certain thought, you create a new connection. You rewire itself. I always try and think of, have you seen you take a helicopter view, you look down on the highway in Dubai, there's all these little networks, these highways. It's kind of like neuroplasticity, and you keep going down the one highway. If you keep going down it, you create and strengthen those pathways. When you create and strengthen those pathways, it becomes easier, like habit, to keep going down them without a thought. So then it becomes more of an unconscious part of the default mode network thing.
That's why you don't want to rely on motivation. You want to rely on habit formation in terms of life-changing behaviors.
Absolutely. I mean, because we know that, there's several theories for the brain aging process. And one of them is we lose efficacy to release dopamine. So you don't want to be relying on dopamine all the time. And you don't want to be relying on motivation all the time. You want to create these patterns that are just like so familiar to you that it just feels like second nature.
Yeah, that's sad that our dopamine goes down, because it makes things much more challenging as you age to find joy in the same things that you used to previously.
Yeah, it is. And look, apart from pathology, we know certain disorders we can't produce the dopamine, but it is scary that we lose that as we get older.
In terms of making bad behaviors, like say you are an alcoholic, or say you are even just like eating poorly, let's say something as simple that many Americans and people around the world can relate to, that also is developing a neural pathway in your brain. So how do you overcome that? Yeah,
I always say that your brain doesn't know the difference between right or wrong. It just knows information. If you feed it alcohol, and it gives you the response. You got to remember, it's also neuroplasticity is also based on how strong of an emotion it has. This is why certain breakups are hard to get over. It's like, how emotionally attached are you? How good did the alcohol make you feel? If it made you feel really good and euphoric, and you're going to want to seek that pleasure again. And if you do it again, you just keep creating these bad habits, and it takes a lot of strength mentally, physiologically, to overcome certain behaviors. that's why it's scary, right? This is why drug addiction, is very hard to overcome from a physiological standpoint and a neurological standpoint. So these habits, it doesn't matter whether you think they're bad or good, it is just information into your brain. And it gets, as we get older, we lose our cognitive reserves, the built up reserves that are there to help us fight off the negative thoughts or fight off the bad habits. So it just you become weaker in being able to say no to these things.
So how do you make yourself stronger? How
Mentally?
do you make your brain stronger? Yeah.
I actually call it, how do you get a jacked brain?
Yeah.
It comes down to function, which we'll talk about. Function, it comes down to structural. It comes down to living a healthy life and just delaying the onset of these brain health related disorders.
Before we get into that, let's talk about these brain health disorders. What is the difference, right, between somebody who's a bit forgetful, maybe forgetting names, forgetting where their keys are, forgetting simple things here and there, versus full on cognitive dementia, Alzheimer's disease? When does it become a concern?
I love that question because so many people automatically think, oh my gosh, I've got Alzheimer's, I've got dementia because I start to forget my keys. And although some of the early signs of cognitive decline is short-term memory loss, such as where are my keys and where do I live, that can also occur under stress. I'm in my mid-30s. I've no signs of cognitive decline as I know, but sometimes I do forget because I've got so much going on in my brain. So we don't want to get too scared. I'm sure you've come across people who think that, oh no, I've got a bump on my head. Does that mean I have a tumor? People just jump to WebMD and they jump to conclusions. It's the same thing, right? Mm-hmm. But let's define globally what dementia is. It's a set of cognitive decline symptoms. And dementia is the umbrella term that is used to describe all these other neurodegenerative diseases, neurodegenerative. So it's a process that happens over time, 20, 30 years. Your first symptom of Alzheimer's disease may begin in your 60s, but that has been starting in your late 20s, early 30s, which is why I'm really advocating for people to live a healthy life in their 30s, where that's when the real damage occurs, because that's when the brain begins to atrophy. So you've got Alzheimer's disease, you've got Parkinson's dementia, you've got frontotemporal dementia, you've got vascular dementia. And so they all sit underneath dementia. Now, the reason why we know so much about Alzheimer's disease is because that's the most prevalent. Currently, around 6 million people in America have Alzheimer's disease, 55 million people worldwide. That number is said to triple by the year 2050. Wow. Staggering. Absolutely unbelievable.
And that's because of these lifestyle things that people are doing?
Well, yes and no. Well, let's first differentiate the difference between, you've got many different risk factors, right? We've got genetic mutations and then we've got genetic risk factors. And I think it's important to differentiate these. So genetic mutations, that's when you've got a mutation in your genetic code. There's something that has happened there which will definitely cause you to get early onset Alzheimer's disease. For example, if you've got a mutation on chromosome 4, we know you're going to get Huntington's disease. Mm-hmm. It's just, an error. And currently we have 3 genetic errors in that, and that is the APP, amyloid precursor protein, and then you've got presenilin 1 and presenilin 2. So if we have the mutations there, we know 100% penetrant, you will get this disease. Sadly, if you look at the cases, that only represents 2 to 3% of the cases worldwide. So what's happening with the rest of them? Mm-hmm. Why are people still getting Alzheimer's disease if they don't have the genetic mutations? Then we look at genetic risk factors. And, I really want to talk about this because I think we have overemphasized this gene called the apolipoprotein E, ApoE4 gene. And Chris Hemsworth is known to have 2. So you get one gene from mom, you get a gene, one allele from mom, one from dad. And we have the apolipoprotein E gene. We've got epsilon 2, which is actually quite protective. So if you have an E2, it's a very protective against the disease. If you have E2, E3, it's protective. A very average is an E3, E3. I'm an E3, E3. It just means it's nullified. We don't increase the risk, it doesn't decrease the risk. If you have one allele of E4, it raises your risk. If you have two, it raises your risk by 10 to 12 times. So it's quite scary. But I want everyone to know that if you test positive for these genes, I've just said it is a risk factor. It does not mean that you will get Alzheimer's disease. In fact, 50% of people who go on through life with E4 without even getting Alzheimer's disease. Arguably, they are probably living a very healthy lifestyle. But then you've got this other subset of people who are getting the disease, but they don't have the E4 genes. They don't have the genetic mutations. So what could it be? It turns out that it really does come down to the way you're living your life.
So we can essentially prevent ourselves from getting Alzheimer's.
You can prevent yourself from getting dementia and Alzheimer's disease. These are diseases that are completely preventable, but it's up to you, and it's up to you to be empowered every single day. It's an individual effort that needs to be practiced, and it needs to be done every day.
And so what is Alzheimer's dementia?
Well, Alzheimer's dementia is a form of neurodegenerative disease that is predominantly made, there's two theories. Currently, which is scary, we've currently got something called the amyloid hypothesis. Amyloid cascade hypothesis. That's what we currently know of right now, where we get the accumulation of this protein. And I'm not even going to call it a toxic protein because we all have it in our brain. And accumulation of these proteins that end up aggregating outside of the neuron. So remember, you've got the neuron, the cell body, you've got the axon that comes off of it. This is outside of the neuron. I told you earlier that neurons communicate with each other, 20 to 30,000, maybe 15,000 connections. So if these amyloid plaques, and they clump together, if they are building up outside of the neuron, they are interfering with the way the neurons connect and wire together. When our neurons connect, they fire something. We have something called a synapse, and that's how they communicate with each other. That's how we think. That's how we produce actions. So this ends up getting disrupted. So currently, that is the current hypothesis. But then we've also got something else that happens within the neuron itself, and that is the tau protein. So we've got these neurofibrillary tangles, and they're basically, if you think of the analogy I like to use is a roller coaster, right? So you've got these neurofibrillary, I would say, I can't even explain it, but they end up, what happens is they end up aggregating within the cell, and they end up killing the neuron itself as well.
So these amyloid plaques build up, create these neurofibrillary tangles that basically prevent communication between and potentially lead to death of the neuron itself.
Yeah, and the very early signs of this happening is within an area deep within the temporal lobes called the hippocampus. And the temporal lobes just sit here. So deep within that structure is this seahorse-shaped structure called the hippocampus. And that's where we have a lot of our memory formations, a lot of our learning occurring there. And we get the breakdown and degradation of the neurons within there, which is why some of the earliest signs are memory loss, forgetfulness.
And clinically, I mean, I've seen over my career many, many patients with a variety of different dementias. Ultimately, the symptoms tend to be overlapping in many of the conditions, meaning memory loss. Some have, like for Parkinson's, there's a movement component. It's really traumatic. And I think people really need to understand, like, it's not just grandpa or grandma's getting older and they're a little forgetful. Like, it can be really tragic to see your family go through that and to see them literally look at you and maybe not recognize you for a moment or a few hours, or only recognize you for a few hours over the course of many weeks. And so it is really a traumatic experience for people to go through. And I think if people realize that it's in our power to hopefully stave that off or prevent that for the large majority of people, I think that's extremely powerful.
Yeah, it's, I think to myself, you wake up with your brain and you wake up with who you are every day. You go to sleep with who you are. This is the only disease that robs you of who you are. And this became very apparent to me. I've seen a patient who has actually looked at me and said, "Who am I?" Mm-hmm. And it was really scary. When you really forget who you are, you forget who your kids are. But then it can also be scary when you get your memory back for a moment and you remember what is happening. And so it's actually a very big burden, an economic burden and a very big burden on the caregiver itself. But something we should also point out is what I'm also advocating for in terms of women's rights in science and research is 2 out of 3 dementia cases or Alzheimer's disease cases are women. So we know that there is a hormonal component with that as well.
What do we think the hormonal component is?
Although not my field, I am going to be interviewing Dr. Lisa Mosconi, who, she's researching this field, but it does have to do a lot with the estrogen. Yeah. So we're born with, if you are born with a uterus and ovaries, we have many estrogen receptors in our brain. And evidently after menopause, we lose that. And that's one of the reasons. Another reason we believe is just the fact that we are living longer.
Yeah, I mean, I think during menopause, certainly there's changes because there's less estrogen to the brain, but also the hot flashes have negative impacts because that's actually an error in temperature regulation in our brain.
Correct. Yeah. And that can also disrupt sleep as well, which we know that sleep is a huge component of staving off these disease states.
Are you sick of going to the doctor only to have them talk at you for 15 minutes and leave without knowing exactly why they're prescribing you this certain medication and what exactly the next step is to take to optimize your health? Wouldn't it be great to finally find a doctor who actually listens to you, answers your questions, and doesn't rush you out the door? Well, at my practice, Rena Malik, MD, I aim to do just that. I specialize in taking care of patients who have issues with their sex lives, issues with their bladder, with their hormone health, or are having pain in their pelvic region or with sex. My goal is to give you the time and attention you deserve so you can leave with a clear understanding of your condition as well as our treatment plan that's optimized for your goals. During your visit, I'm 100% present with you for an entire hour. And after you leave, you can reach me. It is super easy to send me a message through our secure portal, and I'll get back to you within 24 to 48 hours. No questions asked, no hidden fees. Scheduling is easy. Just visit our website, renamalicmd.com/appointments. We see patients in both Irvine and Beverly Hills, California, and I see patients virtually in California, Florida, Illinois, Maryland, New York, New Jersey, and Virginia. Oh, and don't forget Texas. If you're outside these states, consider seeing me for an educational visit. I look forward to seeing you. What are early signs? So you said short-term memory loss. What are some other early signs that people can pick up, maybe even younger, that they may need to really be keeping an eye on this and amping up their prevention potentially?
It changes in cognition. So as I mentioned earlier, cognitive performance, which we look at, you've got decision-making, information processing speed, your ability to think faster. These things can start to decline. We have global cognition. And I will tell you that the degree to which your cognition lasts is how much that you want to push it, right? You go to the gym. How do we make our muscles bigger? We have to place it under stress. Your brain is the same. If you can place your brain under stressful situations, whether albeit through learning a new task, anything that is actually going to send hormetic stress, a good stress to your brain to push further in a specific area is going to be good for it. Remember, our brain it's highly adaptable, and every area is accounted for. Every area in the brain is accounted for, from hearing to our visual cortex, to seeing, to balancing, to posture. So everything has a purpose in the brain. It's not just there. And the brain kind of takes the theory of use it or lose it. So if you neglect to use a certain area of the brain, and this is why a lot of cognitive decline actually occurs post when somebody retires, because they're not utilizing every aspect of their brain. They're not learning, they're not thinking as much, they're not placing their brain under stress. So your brain is like, okay, use it or lose it.
What are good stresses? So let's talk about someone who's like got a lot of stress in their life.
Yeah.
How can they, like that's a majority of people, right? People are working full time. They're taking care of kids. They're taking care of aging parents. They're taking care of their spouse, whatever, right? Some people have multiple jobs. So like, how can you differentiate, like, obviously the day-to-day stressors, which are not necessarily positive all the time, to those that are good stressors?
That's an important one. So when we talk about bad stress, that is things such as putting yourself under chronic stressful situations that lasts a long time. But also, I must admit, there's also nutrient deficiencies, which could signal a chronic stress to your brain. We don't want that. Mm-hmm. Good stresses are things like exercising, thermal regulation, such as getting into a sauna and releasing these heat shock proteins. That is a good stress. That is something that signals to your brain, okay, I'm under stress. Like, for example, this morning I posted about mitochondrial biogenesis, the creation of new and healthy mitochondria. We need this. We know that mitochondria is a powerhouse of our cell, where the site of energy production, ATP production. We can induce more mitochondria through getting into cold water, because when we do, we basically signal a stressful situation to our body and our brain. And what happens is your body says, oh my gosh, she's freezing. She's actually going to die, hypothermic. We have to warm her up. How do we warm her up? Well, we have to do that through mitochondria. So the mitochondria get to work. You start to produce this heat. And then because it's so stressed, it says, guys, we don't have enough mitochondria. Let's produce more. So that is a positive, stressful situation. I've induced stress to create a positive outcome. And so that's where I would say that is good stress. This happens under heat stress as well. If you go into the sauna, we do the same thing. We release these heat shock proteins, which can be a really good beneficial thing. And in fact, they've actually done, there was a really great study that was done that showed that 4 days per week of infrared sauna can ameliorate some of the amyloid beta depositions in a brain.
Like looking at biopsies of the brain?
Correct, yeah.
And so what about with cold?
That's very early research.
What about with cold exposure? Have they done that investigation?
No, we know that one of the most robust responses to cold exposure is the release of norepinephrine, which is a neurotransmitter, neuromodulator. It's involved in vigilance. When released from the brain, it can be released from the body as well, but it's involved in vigilance and focus, and it's a really great neurotransmitter. So we know that occurs. We also know that we can activate a pathway called the RBM3 pathway. They're now experimenting this with post-concussive patients, which putting these heads into, after they've had a concussion, like dunking their heads into a bucket of ice to cool the brain down. So we know that, but that's very, it's still so early.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, interesting stuff. I think ultimately probably also reducing your bad stressors would be beneficial as best as possible.
That's actually one of the risk factors. So even looking at how can you minimize, I wouldn't say mitigate because it is 2024. How can you minimize the amount of stress that you place upon your system every day? Even deep breathing is a really great measure, and you can actually measure your stress. I wear an Oura ring, and right now it does things like now it picks up on daytime stress, but we can also see through heart rate variability how well we've slept. We can increase our heart rate variability with deep breathing, and I'm trying to do everything I can to minimize my stress. And it starts with giving yourself a head start every morning. If I'm up against a very stressful day, I want to know that at least I've slept well. At least I've woken up with some cognitive reserve and I've slept well. That's the first thing that I want to know. If I exercise, I'm armoring my brain as well. So that's another thing to kind of shield me against some of the, if I'm hydrated and I'm eating well and I'm eating nutritious food, plant-based diets are really great as well. I'm an omnivore, I eat everything, but really, giving your brain the best outcome it can. So when it is about to go to war, because you never know, things happen every day, you want it to be protected. and be strong enough. That's why I call it, how do you get a jacked brain?
So going to war, meaning just dealing with stressors.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Your brain doesn't know the difference between you getting hit by a car, or you going through a divorce, or you just getting a bad notification from an ex on your phone. It is the degree to which you tell your brain that you are affected. Someone can get hit by a car and have the same stress as someone who's just gotten a notification on their phone.
Yeah, or just read the news.
Correct. And what we actually see in schizophrenic patients, in depressive patients, we see that they actually have low levels of neuroplasticity. So anything that's going to raise the outcome of neuroplasticity as well is going to help you. So these lifestyle factors that we speak about is really,
Yeah. So you've sort of alluded to them, but what are the 5 most important things? Let's say 5 things. I think you've mentioned 5 already. 5 most important things we can do to help our brain health, and maybe in order of importance if you had to pick.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm biased because I mentioned to you that I'm currently doing my doctorate, and it's literally in exercise and mild cognitive impairment. So I'm looking at many different studies, interventions such as resistance training, aerobic training, and what these have on global cognition and on the structural components of the brain. So I think at the bottom of the pyramid, the best thing that you can be doing is exercising. I know that the sleep people and the nutrition people probably have something else to say, but let's talk about exercise and what that's doing.
Yeah.
So we've got aerobic training, and that's generally your long distance running. That's generally when you're getting a lot of blood flow through the brain. Remember, you mentioned earlier heart health, and it's the same thing with the brain. What's good for the heart is good for the brain.
And good for your genitals.
As you mentioned. Yeah, and good for your genitals. Why?
Yeah. Because there's blood vessels to the genitals, and they're usually smaller than those to the heart or the brain. So you're going to see problems in your genitals long before you see them elsewhere.
Correct. And your brain is the most vascular rich organ in the entire body, meaning it is infiltrated with blood vessels, capillaries, veins. Like, these are important structural components of the brain. So let's just actually think about the heart for a moment. Okay, you've got the aorta, and branching off the aorta, you've got the carotid arteries, and then you've got the vertebral arteries, which is the posterior blood supply to the brain. And everything else is just branching off of these 2 arteries. So every time your heart pumps, you get a massive perfusion, big or small, of blood to the brain. The brain loves that because you're getting an influx of nutrients and oxygen, and we need that. And it turns out that even the smallest 1 cell thick capillaries in your brain need to be utilized because they are essentially providing your brain with blood. Oftentimes during cognitive decline, they are the first things to go. They go under stress. So the first things to go during actually hypertension, elevated blood pressure, is your capillaries. So every time you kill off a tiny little supply of blood to the brain, what happens? That means the neuron is not getting fed, so it dies. Mm-hmm. So we need to maintain our vasculature. And how do we do that? Through adequate blood flow. How do we do that? Through exercise. So there's, aerobic exercise is the most widely studied when it comes to cognitive impairment and dementia, because we started off with obviously mice studies, and you can just get a mouse just to run on a wheel. The best things that it does is when you are exercising, you get a rapid release of a neurotropic factor, or a brain-derived neurotropic factor, BDNF. And this is a growth factor for the brain. So what scientists realized early on was that when you do as little as 20 minutes of exercise, you release BDNF. And BDNF, when it acts as a growth factor in the brain, it goes into the hippocampus, and it is responsible for the growth and proliferation of new neurons. Mm-hmm. So it can grow new neurons in the hippocampus. There's also been 2-year follow-up studies that have shown an increase in hippocampal volume. So growing the hippocampus. Now, whether that, and the hippocampal subregions as well, whether that directly relates to improvements in cognition is dependent on the person. But we know that exercise is great for that. What else is aerobic activity doing? Actually, there's a really wonderful study done out of Ben Levine's group. He's a cardiologist by training. What he did, Rena, was he took 53 50-year-olds, sedentary, otherwise healthy 50-year-olds. He subjected them to 4 hours of maximal exercise per week. And when I say maximal, I'm talking it was around 75% of their maximum heart rate. 4 hours a week. So it was a lot. Yeah. He did this as an intervention for 2 years. Guess what he found? He reversed the age-related decline of your heart by 20 years. So he was looking at the hearts of these 50-year-olds, and they were presenting with the hearts of 30-year-olds. And he saw this through something called, as we age, we get stiffening of the ventricles. Specifically, we get left ventricular stiffness. So that, it hypertrophy. So it gets bigger, so it constricts our blood. So therefore, we can't get a lot of blood through stroke volume per pump. Okay, so that's scary because that means with every heartbeat, we have less blood flow going to the brain. He improved that over time. And I think that is absolutely incredible. We call that cardiac remodeling. So you can literally remodel your cardiac system. Your cardiac system is just like your muscular system. So through cardiac remodeling, through putting your body under these stressful situations, you can rewire your actual heart so it can be pumping better. And remember, your aorta, these big blood vessels, are actually made of muscle. So the stronger they are, the better equipped they are at delivering blood to the brain. So remember, blood flow. Then we'll move on and we can talk about, and we know this, I know you've had Dr. Andy Galpin on the podcast, and he spoke tremendously about VO2 max, which is a measure of your cardiorespiratory fitness. We know that even just an increase in your VO2 max can give you a if you go from below average to above average, it can give you an increased life expectancy of 5 years. So I think everyone, in terms of protocols, I think everyone should understand their baseline, where they sit for their fitness. I think everyone should get a VO2 max test, because it is in the pursuit of a higher VO2 max that you get the real benefits. It's not about the number. It is about, what do I have to do to increase my VO2 max? And this doesn't happen, you can't just, you can go and get blood work done. Let's just say you've got low vitamin D. You can go and just take maybe 10,000 IUs of vitamin D per day for 2-3 months, and you go back and get a blood test, you'll see a dramatic increase. It's not the same for VO2 max. VO2 max, like to increase your VO2 max, you really need to be stressing your system on a daily basis. So in the pursuit of that is where you'll get the benefits.
Yeah, and you posted something very recently, I think it was on your stories, maybe about 1 point of VO2 max increase led to some really dramatic change. What was that?
45-day increase.
Yes.
Increase in life expectancy.
Yeah, so improving your VO2 max by 1 point improves your lifespan by 45 days.
That is correct, yeah.
That's really impressive.
It is, and it is because of the changes in the heart.
Yeah, so we know now, based on what you've told me, is that improving your aerobic exercise daily at a reasonable VO2 max around 75%, it seems like, you'll see improvements in cardiac remodeling, you'll see improvement in hippocampal volume, and in terms of sexual function, you'll see improvement in erections for men, and probably similar improvements in arousal for women in terms of clitoral tumescence. Really great reasons to incorporate aerobic exercise.
Improvements in global cognition as well.
And well, I would assume that would be related to your hippocampal volume. But yes,
absolutely.
Yeah.
And then we move on to resistance training, which again, biased to it, but I think that it offers a tremendous amount of positivity to the brain from a structural perspective, right? And my area of expertise is in an EEG, electroencephalogram, where you actually measure the connectivity of the brain, the functionality of the brain. But then when we look at the structural components of the brain, which you can see through an MRI, for example, we can see changes in the gray matter cortex. There was one study that I came across, and this was back in, I think, 2016, which showed that 80% of brain gray matter is modifiable by exercise.
And for the audience, what is gray matter?
So we've got both gray matter and white matter. The gray matter sits on the outer cortex of the brain. It's generally made up of the neuron cell bodies. Mm-hmm. That's why if you see it on appearance, it can come darker. And then the white matter is our axons. It's the myelinated neurons. And these are the things that, are responsible for conduction and conduction speed and velocity. This is what you'll test if you go and get a nerve conduction study or an EMG and someone is, picking up on, for example, MS, multiple sclerosis. You'll see complete conduction block or slowing of conduction speed. And so that's the white matter of the brain, and that's deep within the brain. And the outside is your gray matter, and that thins over time. Mm-hmm. We get thinning of the gray matter cortex due to age as well. However, it doesn't have to be. So we do get the loss of neurons as we get older. Arguably, over the age of around 25 to 30, we start to see an atrophy in our brain.
And are those neurons, is that reversible?
It's preventable, but it's not. So adult neurogenesis, unfortunately, very controversial as well, doesn't exist from what I've seen in the literature outside of the hippocampus. So, look, if that was true, we'd all be running around growing new brain cells,
which
right?
would be amazing.
Yes. Angiogenesis. So synaptogenesis exists. Mm-hmm. So genesis creation. You can create new synapses and new connections. We know that to be true through neuroplasticity. And there's great research coming out now on lion's mane and other adaptogens that can really help with that process. But back to resistance training. And there was a wonderful study that really signified my understanding and love for this field. And that was by Harold et al., who basically did a systematic review of all of the literature on resistance training and mild cognitive impairment. And he found many things. One thing was Bente Peterson is a wonderful researcher. She coined this term called myokine. And a myokine is a muscle-based protein coming from the cytokine family. And what she found was that under contraction of a muscle fiber, when you contract it and you squeeze it together, you have the release of these proteins that are only released from the muscle fiber. When they're released, they go into the bloodstream and they can cross the blood-brain barrier, and they can go through and connect in on different receptors in the brain and have positive effects of the brain. So, for example, there is one called irisin. Mm-hmm. Irisin is a myokine named after the Greek god of Iris, and because it acts as a messenger molecule. So when it's released from the muscle belly, it goes up, crosses the blood-brain barrier, and it improves the proliferation of BDNF. So it actually helps BDNF express itself more. We've got cathepsin B. So all of these wonderful myokines that are literally like fertilizer for the brain. But not just that, we know that these can go into other organs such as prostate. We've got receptors on the prostate, on the ovaries. We've got receptors on our liver. And there's a really great study now in Cell Press that showed that exercise via lactate, which lactate is it's a byproduct of exercise, but it's also another myokine, can actually inhibit tumor cell growth.
Really?
Yeah.
Doing resistance training is improving this myokine release,
correct,
which is then going to our brains and having improvements in basically a multitude of ways.
Yeah.
Which can be, these wonderful growth factors that help our brains function better and potentially have proliferation.
Yes, absolutely. That's a really good summary. Yeah. And just these myokines are not anywhere else. They are literally released under tension. You have to really be lifting hard. This is why when you're going to the gym, you should be lifting, you have to be lifting hard and not these tiny little weights, because you want to put your muscles under tension for them to release these growth factors. But we've got circulating tumor cells that can actually be downregulated through aerobic physical activity and also through the myokine release.
Yeah, I love lifting, and I think it's addictive. Once you I can lift more, it's actually really sort of fun.
Yeah, and you've also seen the studies of the age-related loss in our strength and muscle. Yeah. So even just for the creation of like stronger muscles, stronger, more strength as we age. Because one of the number one causes of death, the CDC actually released this, over the age of 80 is falls. Mm-hmm. And that's really scary. And then you think, if you reverse engineer everything, right? Well, why do we fall? Okay. Sometimes cognition, lack of cognition of where to actually know where you are in space and time can cause that. We see balance. You can get atrophy in the cerebellum, which is the mini brain, if you will, and that's responsible for our balance and coordination. So that can also result in it. But then we also know that strength, obviously, and muscle loss, sarcopenia can result in that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, falls are some of the things I worry about very much so in my patients, because a lot of them wake up at night to urinate, and then that leads to falls because they're getting up, they're in the middle of the night where they're not fully alert yet. It's dark. Like, there's so many things that we talk about with our patients, but ultimately, I don't think people realize how bad a fall is when you're in your 70s and 80s, and how that can literally increase your mortality risk by 20%, just from having a fall within that first year. So it is really important. So strength is going to help with that as well. Yeah. So, okay, we talked about aerobic exercise, resistance exercise. What's next?
The other one is a subspecialty. So my company is actually called Neuroathletics, and I founded this in 2014, and that was because there is a third part of exercise that we all neglect, and that's neurocognitive training. And it is using things such as your reaction training, which is actually so beneficial for the brain. Many people say to me, Louisa, can I just do a puzzle or Sudoku? If it places your brain under pressure, then yes, because your brain will adapt to it. But a really great thing that you can do is just get 2 handballs and throw them to the wall. And that's this part of this neurocognitive training, reaction training, hand-eye coordination, balance. These things are actually worthwhile to do as you age.
Yeah, so let's break that down. How often should you do this, and with what regularity, in terms of like how long should you be spending doing something like that?
You only really need to do around 7 to 10 minutes a day. There's been great studies that have done that shows that juggling can actually improve the gray matter cortex.
So Sudoku's not enough?
Sudoku's not enough.
Okay, good. Because my mom's obsessed.
But do you know what's actually good?
Yeah.
Like anything where you're learning new language. And one thing that we do with some of our clients too is we take into consideration the auditory cortex. We know that hearing loss is another risk factor for dementia. But doing like hearing tests, like maybe react to a sound that you can hear. Or we do eye patches at Neuroathletics. We get all of, some people to wear an eye patch, which literally closes off half of your brain or closes off half of your visual cortex. So it makes your brain work harder because it thinks, oh my gosh, I've only got 50% of my vision. I have to work harder. And it places your brain under stress.
Yeah, that's
or complete blindfold. Yeah.
But yeah, I guess you can be progressive about it, right? Like you can do it with both eyes open. You can do it with one eye patch on, with a blindfold, to work your way through.
Yeah, exactly. And it's fun. Anyone can do it. It's cheap. 7 minutes a day. Just get a handball and just throw it to the wall and just try and not drop it for a minute. If you don't do that, then go to 2 minutes and then 3 minutes.
And it seems like it's something you could do with your kids. Like for me, like my boys would love that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay. So we've got aerobic exercise, resistance exercise, neurocognitive training. Yeah. What else?
And then one really great study, which I'd be remiss if I didn't speak about this, which has nothing to do with exercise per se, but it's got to do with the quality of the connections that you have. So there was an 80-year study that was done out of Harvard, which showed that the number one thing for a healthy performing brain in your 80s, 90s and beyond is the quality of your relationships. It doesn't just mean the quality of your like romantic relationships. It is, do you have supportive people around you? And creating a really great social network is going to be key to a healthy brain as well.
Yeah, that is so important. And I see a lot of older patients, and I often ask them like, what are you doing? Like, because sometimes their partners have passed away, or the closest people to them are getting older, and the ones that thrive are the ones who get involved in their community in some way. They may go to bridge games, they may go golf with their buddies that they still have, or make new friends. And that is really, or they'll volunteer, even going to the library and volunteering or something.
Correct.
And that's sort of how they maintain those social connections. Because I think even there's some data that even the small connections, like the connections you have with people in passing, are also very important to foster because they help us connect with people in a different way.
Yeah. And then you think about, well, why is that? It could be the release of different neurochemicals when you're with somebody else and you're bonding, and that could be really great. Mm-hmm. It could be the fact that you could be learning from somebody else because your brain is like, oh, I'm learning from somebody else. I'm learning new things, more connections, more growth. But if you understand just the structural components, which I mentioned, which is we need adequate blood flow to feed the neurons. What we don't want is neuron loss. So how do we keep getting blood flow to the brain? How do we keep strengthening the connections between the brain? And then we'll talk now, we can shift gears and talk about sleep, because then that's also probably the next pillar of what you can be doing to help a healthy performing brain as well. And so we've done exercise, we've done stress, lower stress, we've done positive social connections, and now we'll do the fourth one, which is sleep. Sleep is not just this nocturnal thing that we go through. It is a repair process that is absolutely imperative for your brain. And sleep, we can just categorize it as we've got REM sleep and we've got deep sleep, and your brain needs both of them. Mm-hmm. And there's now, the latest research is actually showing that regularity actually is more important than quantity and quality.
Really?
I would argue it is all important, but regularity, the time that you go to sleep. Remember, Rena, what did I say to you at the start? Your brain loves regularity, familiar. It loves it just wants to do the same thing every day. Don't shock it. Don't scare it, right? Yeah. And so we've got a really wonderful process, and this is stage 3 sleep. So we've got stage 1 when we're falling asleep. Stage 2 are in light sleep. These are non-rapid eye movement. Then we go into non-REM stage 3 sleep. And on an EEG, did you ever go into a PSG?
I've actually, my son had one.
Oh, nice. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, what you'd see these big, long waves, and they're called slow delta waves, but slow wave sleep, which is also deep
PSG
sleep.
is a polysomnograph or a sleep study for those of you listening or watching. Yeah.
And when you go in there, you've got a lot. I want everyone to know, because everyone's like, well, what's the difference between that and maybe a wearable? It's like there's a lot. We're monitoring a lot of activity during that. But you see what happens during this stage, this delta wave pattern, is we know that your brain does many things. One thing is, this is where we get the release of testosterone. Mm-hmm. It was 95% of male testosterone is released during deep sleep.
Not 95, but a lot. So what happens in testosterone is you release the highest amount is between 7 and 10 a.m. And then it sort of goes through a pulsatile, but sort of slowly weaning throughout the day. And then it starts releasing again around 2 to 4 a.m. and goes back upwards. But it starts in the sleep. Yeah. And that would be in deep slow wave sleep. Probably most important for that first 4 hours of sleep. So like going to sleep from 10 to 2 rather than like the 2 to 6 or that sort of time frame is more important.
And that's why timing matters, right? Mm-hmm. We also get the release of growth hormone during that stage, which is responsible for the growth and repair of our muscles. So this is why when we're in deep sleep, it is a repair process for our brain. But we also know that we activate a system, which is similar to a washing machine, if you will. It's called the glymphatic system. Mm-hmm. Now, I mentioned neurons. What sticks between the neurons are these other types of cells. It's our chief immunity cell in the brain, and they're called glial cells. Comes from the Greek word glue. Can you tell I'm Greek? And they stick, they bind together between the two neurons, and they shrink in size during deep sleep. And when they shrink, it means that we can have our cerebral spinal fluid be able to wash away in this beautiful synchronous way, and it gets excreted, taking with it toxins, taking with it the hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease, which is amyloid beta, and it washes it through the brain, washes it out through the system. So you wake up, you feel good. Normally, if you wake up and you've got brain fog, which is probably quite a big symptom of, maybe you just didn't get enough deep sleep and you didn't activate this system. Mm-hmm. This system is blocked if you're having marijuana or alcohol. I just want everyone to know that it can also be blocked under certain medications as well.
Yeah, so that's, the deep sleep thing. I think people don't realize like what makes good quality sleep.
Oh, yeah.
I think really people are like, well, yeah, I'm sleeping 7-8 hours. I'm getting the right amount of sleep. And I always, for me, I didn't even realize it either. I used to drink, I'm a physician, so we drink coffee all the time. So I used to drink coffee late in the day. And I realized when I stopped that and I started, and I could fall asleep fine. I mean, I was chronically sleep deprived as a resident. I could fall asleep anywhere. But I would fall asleep fine, but I'd still feel tired. And I realized once I limited my caffeine intake to prior to noon, and now I drink decaf a lot of the times, my sleep is way better.
Well, that's because caffeine, obviously, there's a half-life to it, so it interrupts sleep. And caffeine is an adenosine blocker, which we know adenosine builds up during the day, which makes us tired.
Yeah.
And so we want to try and do everything we can. I always say you're preparing for sleep the day before.
Yeah.
Or the morning that you wake up, you are setting your circadian rhythm from the first time you see sunlight around, 12 hours after that was when we're going to get tired. We really want to be in deep sleep. And then another thing that will kick you out of that stage as well is light. And you think, well, I've got a dark room, but even the smallest amount, maybe a street light. For my parents, street lights. I live in New York City. I mean, there's light everywhere. But I wear a mask every night. So there's one more thing. And this is new research in the last, I would say, 6 years. We know that in order to fall asleep and stay asleep, our core body temperature needs to drop 2 degrees. So keeping a cool environment can help you. There's a difference between ambient temperature of the room, and your actual thermal temperature. Some people like to sleep on a thermal mattress. But if you don't have that, you don't need it. You can obviously tamper with the temperature in your room, or even sleep with your feet outside of the sheets, because that's where we, get rid of our
Isn't
heat.
wearing socks actually reduce your core body temperature?
Yeah, it does. So doing all these tiny little, I hate the word hacks, but these tiny little things can really make an improvement at lowering your core body temperature throughout the night and enabling you to have a deep sleep.
So sleep regularity, though, is number one. So
yes,
even on the weekends, sleeping in on the weekends, probably not ideal.
No. And remember, you can't, your sleep isn't like, it's not like debt that you repay to the bank. So it's not like I'll sleep 12 hours on the weekend. I know, right? And one thing I want everyone to know is the study that changed my life. There's either always a patient, a client, or a study that changes you. And the one that changed me for the game was a study done on healthy adult men. And it was published in PNAS, where they subjected them to sleep deprivation of just 1 week. Sleep deprivation, by the way, guess what? How many hours? It was 6 hours.
Yeah.
You know which one I'm talking about.
Yeah.
It was the epigenetic change. You've probably mentioned it, but that changed the game for me, where they found a change in 711 genes. The ones that were upregulated were the ones responsible for tumor growth. The ones that were downregulated were the ones responsible for immunity.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I mean, I think sleep, I love talking about sleep, and I think that we're the only species, and Matt Walker says this, we're the only species who intentionally sleep deprive ourselves. Our brains hurt us sometimes too, right? Because we let ourselves think like, oh, I just want to do this one more thing before bed, or I just want to I want to doom scroll or watch another episode of TV or whatever it is that we feel we need, when actually the most restorative thing would be to go to sleep.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, what happens even when you get the buildup of these amyloid plaques, it has this cycle where if you don't sleep, you raise your risk of developing this disorder. But then when you have it, it also prevents you from sleeping.
Yeah, it's really, really tough.
I'm not going to go back into, I know we are focusing on brain health, and we're focusing on sleep right now. But I want everyone to know that there are only 2 real medications right now that are attacking the amyloid. But it's very slow acting. By the time, they're administered through an IV, by the time they actually get in and, ameliorate these plaques and tangles, it takes a very long time. And the process of building up the amyloid is taking place. So really, no drug really is curing. We have no cure for Alzheimer's disease. We have no reversal of Alzheimer's disease. We don't even the actual FDA approved drugs that we have and only having a very small amount of an effect. So banking on the things that actually work from a preventative standpoint, such as sleep, is going to just do so many more wonders than any drug ever could.
Are these things, so patients who have dementia, maybe Alzheimer's is a little more challenging to get patient buy-in, but like to get them to sleep better or to get them to exercise, are they going to see improvements in their symptoms at all?
Yes and no. So if you've already got MCI, so mild cognitive impairment, which is a pre-dementia state, you can see the slowing of that. So you can slow the progression of the MCI through all the mechanisms that we discussed earlier, but you can never just halt it, no.
Yeah, I mean, I think it can help their other health conditions too, because very often, because it's very often a vascular issue, they also have high blood pressure. They also have maybe have had a stroke. They, you know, these other horrible things that have happened, and so like they can help with those conditions as well.
Yeah, absolutely,
and improve their quality of life. Quick break from this episode to let you know I am so grateful that you're spending part of your day with me. I started creating content online to empower people to learn more about their bodies without needing to go see a doctor, pay a copay, wait in a waiting room, or find parking. And it has been one of the most rewarding experiences of my life. If you want to help support our mission of providing free education, please consider joining our premium membership. There you will have access to ad-free episodes, which are released early, as well as free transcripts and the opportunity to ask me anything. And these questions are answered in our monthly AMA episodes. Support the show and join today at renamalik.supercast.com. Can't wait to see you there. In terms of travel, so you said melatonin. What do you do when you're traveling? Like, how do you, because of course you're going to get jet lagged. Of course your time zones are off. When I do a short trip, I try to stay on the same time zone that I was when I go home, if possible. But I think if you're on a longer trip, you know, what do you tend to do?
So I tend to try and set my circadian rhythm based on where I'm going to land. And I do this through a number of ways. One of the biggest things for traveling is I try and minimize the amount of food that I'm eating on a plane. That's the first thing. The second thing is I do like to sleep as much as possible, banking on sleep, even though I mentioned earlier that it's not like a debt that you can repay to the bank, but you can bank on sleep. So you can put as much sleep in your tank as humanly possible prior to going, just to cater for the jet lag. I'm also using light exposure. I'm doing this through natural sunlight, but also through a 10,000 lux light box that I carry around with me. You can get these on Amazon for about $40. So I'm doing that to help set my circadian rhythm to the time zone that I'm going into.
So like, for example, if you are going from New York to LA, and LA's, your normal circadian rhythm is to wake up at, let's say, 7 a.m., right? But here, 7 a.m. is 4 a.m., right? So what are you doing to prepare for that? And then when you're going back, let's like give some concrete examples.
Yeah, so I would set, I only do it for 72 hours. I will put my body into a state where I'm getting into waking up at 4 a.m. And hopefully going to sleep at 10 p.m. PST, which will be 7 p.m. I will do this through the use of melatonin, through the use of magnesium L-threonate, and through the use of pharma-GABA. And GABA is our chief inhibitory neurotransmitter. And this is just to help me calm my mind down and relax me so I can induce sleep better. Oftentimes it won't work out that way. I'll probably get to bed at, maybe fall asleep at 8 p.m., but then wake up at 5. So it helps.
So you'll like, so you maybe for the 3 days before you'll wake up at, so say you wake up at 7, you wake up at 6, and then you wake up at 5, and you wake up at 4. And what time are you taking these supplements? Like how often before? So say you want to sleep at 7, you're taking them at 6, you're taking them at 5?
No, 20 minutes prior to bedtime.
20 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's when I've seen the most effect for me, and, you know, from the
and then when you're on vacation, you reverse it to go back.
That's correct. And it's all, for me, I don't have jet lag when I go to Australia. It's when I'm coming back that it's a punish for me. So I do everything I can. I even use caffeine to help stimulate me during the moment when I need to wake up as well.
And why don't you eat on a plane?
Because you've already got lowered digestion. You're already up in the air. You've got, first of all, the worst thing about being up in the air is you've got less oxygen, right? And now I went and bought, I haven't used it yet, I bought this drink bottle that can actually help with the oxygenation as well on flight. I mean, I don't know if it's completely, efficacious, but I'm going to try that. But yeah, but pretty much when it comes to food on the plane, you are not moving around. You don't have a lot of blood flow. So digestion is just not going to be at its peak. So you want to just be able to minimize the amount of food that you have to digest at such a high altitude.
Got it. So don't be snacking the whole flight.
Because that's probably one of the reasons why you also feel horrible when you get off a plane.
Yeah. Or drinking or whatever.
Oh my gosh. People who drink on a plane, I don't understand.
Well, as someone who used to drink, I don't drink anymore, but I think it used to be like part of the vacation experience, right?
Yeah.
Like I'm going to have a cocktail on the plane and I'm going to relax and I'm going to maybe go to sleep and it'll help me relax. And maybe you should just take some melatonin before the plane. Do you ever do that? Like just to like make the plane ride faster? Do you like try to sleep on a plane?
If it's an overnight, so tomorrow night I fly out at like 10 p.m. So it'll be an overnight flight. So for me, I will take melatonin just to try and like settle me down so I'm not up wired for 14 hours the entire trip.
Got it.
We didn't touch on REM sleep, and I will because that's the last stage of sleep. That is also very crucial for the brain. So rapid eye movement sleep, we know that on a PSG, you'll see these horizontal eye movements of the brain. And what we know is that you are completely paralyzed from the neck down. But your brain, if you look at these brain waves, it mimics an awake patient. So it's a lot of chaos is happening. And this is generally where we get our memory formation, vivid dreams occur, which is why. And we get also the process of learning and the penetration of learning and skill acquisition. If you've got kids and they're out there learning a skill, it's also going to get penetrated during sleep. Skill takes the form of actual happening in real time, learning of the skill, but also the penetration of the skill.
Yeah, I think I remember the first time I learned that we're paralyzed in our sleep, I was like, how does that even work evolutionarily? Like, what if you get,
yeah.
Like, sometimes you wake up and you're like, you feel like you can't move for a second. And it doesn't happen often, but like, you wake up at the wrong moment or whatever. And it's sort of scary. But two, the learning acquisition thing is really important. And that's one thing I learned from Matt Walker when I was reading his book and stuff, was like these teenagers, right? Their circadian rhythm is a bit later.
Yeah.
And their high school, at least when I was, I think they've gotten better. But when I was in high school, you had to wake up at 7 a.m. to go to school. And that's like 4 hours earlier than your circadian rhythm is really allowing. And so they're losing all that skill acquisition.
Correct. They're losing the skill acquisition. They're as well, what about the amount of dopamine that gets released as well? That, that molecule that motivates us and drives us and, puts forward motion in place. That's not also getting released, at the right time. So that's scary as well.
Yeah. For people who wake up in the middle of the night and have trouble falling asleep, what do you suggest for them?
Do not look at light. And I know many of your viewers are going to be like, well, that's great, Louisa. I'm going to trip going to the bathroom. I would suggest getting lighting on the floor.
Yeah, I tell them to get track lighting. So like when you're walking, it just like it activates to your footstep, but it's motion censored, and usually like just track lighting on the bottom like hallway floor. Yeah,
don't open the fridge. That's going to be like a lot of people think, okay, I'm hungry, I'll go to the fridge. I also say that leave the bed for sleeping. If you're doing other things in there, like, watching TV, maybe doing homework for young kids or whatever that may be, you're also taking away from that sleep pressure. So you really want to minimize the bedroom and just leave it for sleep, and that's it.
Yeah, I've always been so curious why people get these huge master suite bedrooms, because I don't even go in my bedroom except to sleep. Like, I don't spend time in there hanging out, and, like reading a book in the in a chair or something like that. That's in my living space. And so I've always been like very curious as to why people develop these huge, ginormous like bedrooms. Like they're going to be spending all this time, like, doing stuff in their bedroom, but maybe other things. That's okay. Leave it for sex and sleep. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
In terms of reading before bed. So obviously want to avoid looking at a screen. So try not to look at a phone or something. But what about using a Kindle versus reading a real book with some sort of light? Obviously you need some light to read. What do you think about that?
It depends on whether it's actually going to keep you. Some people so for me, like, I'm better off watching a TV show because that just requires nothing from me mentally. When I read, I get stimulated and excited. So that's going to stimulate me. So I choose not to read. But in terms of lighting, it's better than looking at a screen. I know that you can like lower the lighting on the the Kindle. So that's going to be great too. But generally, you really want to just get into bed. I say, so lights out at neuroathletics is 10 p.m. If I want you in bed at 10, I want you asleep by 10. I want you to get actually in bed by around 9:40 and give yourself the 20 minutes of, just relax, sleep latency, and sleep onset. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So we got 4 things, right? 5. What's the 5th thing?
Well, the 5th thing is, I would say it falls under the bandwagon of nutrition. We know that one of the best things that you can have for your brain. Now, I never get involved in nutrition on Instagram. These wars are just absolutely insane. I am an omnivore. I maintain a really great lipid profile, even though I have red meat. I really take that into consideration. We know the brain loves antioxidants. We know that it loves selenium. Okay, we know that it loves vitamin A, vitamin E. So we want to be getting antioxidants from blackberries, blueberries, oranges. We know that it loves vitamin C. These can help protect you against free radicals. These free radicals that occur in our environment, in our daily thoughts, in our stress. And in fact, which recently I've just done an episode dedicated to water. And I didn't even know. I'm currently drinking I'm drinking smart water out of a plastic bottle. These bottles release these tiny microplastics. And apparently, on average, we're all having a credit card worth of microplastics per week.
Yeah, each bottle's like 15 microplastics, and then just think of that I just did a video on this. That's
so you've done the same thing. Okay, great.
So yeah, I mean, I think it's fine. I think like once in a while, as long as you're not always drinking, like you're traveling, you're not home, right? But like I think if you're drinking from a water bottle once in a while, that's cold and not in a hot environment, it's fine. And it's all about the dose, right? So if you are constantly drinking from plastic water bottles that's stored in your hot garage, that's probably not as safe. Or if you're warming up your food in plastic containers, that's not as safe as using a glass. And that's really pretty simple and easy to do. But I don't like to stress people out and be like, oh, you got to get rid of every plastic thing in your house and spend a ton of money to buy more, because it's the dose.
Absolutely. So we know that can help with free radical damage. That is something that's really going to mitigate it and protect it against it. So we want to increase our antioxidant profiles. Sitting under that as well is really, there's so much great research now on creatine. We used to think that creatine was just good for the body. We know that it is really good for the brain from a neuroprotective standpoint. We've seen that postmenopausal women, we've seen them, in a 2-year really great study. I think this was done by Dr. Darren Kandow. He dosed them with around 10 grams of creatine per day. They had improvements in muscle mass and bone density. And I know people are going to say, but Louisa, doesn't this ruin your kidneys? And it doesn't. So creatine is absolutely fantastic for that. We're now seeing the association of creatine and Parkinson's disease. So I know that the Alzheimer's research is going to come. I think it's going to come from a neuroprotective standpoint. So it helps with ATP generation. So cell energy metabolism. We need it. We want it. The next thing is our brain is made of fats and water. And around 20% of our lipids in our brain is made from DHA. And omega-3 fatty acids is another thing that I would definitely recommend anybody. It doesn't matter outside of go and do your blood work, but really having high dose omega-3 fatty acids, EPA and DHA specifically, is going to do wonders for your brain. It's going to do wonders for actually down-regulating inflammation. It's got a huge safety profile, and it can really, really help with these inflammatory biomarkers, but it can also help with cell membrane fluidity.
Yeah, so there's pretty good evidence on omega-3s, and it's very difficult to get enough from our diet, I think. I mean, I think you can do it, but I think it's challenging unless you're eating fish every day or...
But this even depends on the type of fish.
Yeah, so it's very tough.
Yeah.
I think that's a good one. Are you feeling in a rut in the bedroom? Wishing you had the kind of sex life you could brag about? I've spent years helping patients and creating content for people all around the world to improve and optimize their sex life. Today, you can get my knowledge for 100% free with my new ebook called Better Sex, Better Life. In this ebook, I review my top 10 tips for improving your sex life, all from the comfort of your own home. All you have to do is go to renamalikmd.com/morepleasure to download it for free today. What other things in terms of diet, I think whole foods, generally speaking, lots of plants and plant forward, meaning lots of vegetables, lots of fruits, as antioxidant with high antioxidants are very beneficial. Other things that you recommend?
The things that I don't, it's like, okay, just, we know that there is this, people argue, well, saturated fat is bad because it clogs the arteries. And it's like, okay, that's great. As long as you maintain a good lipid profile, like I mentioned, you keep your ApoB down, your LDL down, it's fine. Yeah. And I want to reiterate, like I think one of the worst things that has ever happened in brain health is the fact that people think the brain is made of cholesterol, and dietary cholesterol can pass through the blood-brain barrier. I want to make a note that dietary cholesterol cannot pass through to the brain unless you have a compromised blood-brain barrier. So don't even think about like, oh, avocados are good for your brain. It doesn't work that way.
Yeah. The blood-brain barrier does get weaker, though, as we age.
Yeah, we do get permeability in the blood-brain barrier. And actually, one of the best things to do for that is exercise as well. It really does help with the integrity of the blood-brain barrier via these little capillaries.
Yeah. That's great. In terms of things that cross the blood-brain barrier, medications. So I do a lot of overactive bladder management, and one of the medications we use, unfortunately, for overactive bladder that often insurance covers because it's cheaper is anticholinergics.
Yes.
And these have very, challenging side effects, including dry mouth, dry eyes, constipation. But there's more and more data suggesting that there is a link, there is an association between these medications and dementia. And I can't tell you the number of patients I have who come to me and they're on 16 medications, okay?
16?
Yeah, like
wow.
16. I mean, like high blood pressure, diabetes, high cholesterol. They may be depressed. They may have overactive bladder. And so they're on all these medications. And I'm always like, wait, are you even seeing a benefit? Let's peel it back. Because if you're not seeing a benefit, let's stop these medications because they're not doing you any favors if they're not helping you. So is there anything else that we should be doing to improve brain health that we haven't talked about?
You also should be hydrating. And then look, everything else is an accessory item when it comes to brain health. As long as you're getting like I always say, the cake is exercise, sleep, proper nutrition, and the two nutrients, the two supplements that we discussed. Everything else is an accessory. Ice baths. I have one in my living room because I love it. I think it's great for me. It's an accessory. Your saunas, that is an accessory. Red light therapy, which is something that I'm really getting into now. We know that like near infrared light and red light can penetrate the skin and go into the superficial organs. We're seeing great efficacy for that actually being going into the nose and shooting up to the brain. We're seeing that for stroke patients. Helping with healing and trauma. But again, it's just an accessory. It's not going to have the biggest bang for the buck.
Yeah. What are things that people think are helping? And you mentioned like avocados and things, but what are things that people think help their brain, but they don't?
There is a lot of research on early research on medicinal mushrooms. And I get asked often, do you think that this is going to be good? Like people are taking lion's mane and it's like, it's very nuanced. It's very in small doses. It might help with synaptogenesis, as I mentioned, but there's just a lot of the supplements that you're taking should only be taken if clinically relevant. Like if you're vitamin D deficient, vitamin D is wonderful for the brain. And if you're vitamin D deficient, yes, but if you're over 60, that's fine. Like you're fine. You don't need to be supplementing with absolutely everything.
Yeah, I think that's important. Is there something that you used to think was important for brain health that no longer is? Or something you've changed your mind on?
I did change my mind on plant diversity. I would say that. I was never carnivore, no, but I'm now trying to do more because I'm seeing a lot of research in the way the gut communicates. We've got, it's a bidirectional axis between the brain and the gut. You've got this one fiber, you've got the vagus nerve, which goes down from the brain down into the gut, but then you've got around 10 fibers that go from the gut to the brain, which can help, signal things such as depression, anxiety, schizophrenia. So I'm changing my mind about how important plant diversity is in maintaining a healthy gut to maintain a healthy brain. And I'm sure you're aware of Dr. Chris Palmer, who is completely on the ketogenic side, where he is, advocating for a ketogenic rich diet due to, mitochondrial dysfunction, which is a hallmark of a lot of these diseases in mental illness. But I'm seeing just so much strong evidence, because I'm in the Alzheimer's disease space, on having plant-rich foods for the brain. So
yeah, I think there's a lot of data on fiber, which is what you're getting from plant-rich foods, like the cruciferous vegetables, and how that affects brain health, right? Because you're getting butyric acid, which is then affecting brain health.
So that's one thing I've changed my mind on. And one thing that it's not changed my mind, but something that I'm now really, really pushing for is sex differences. We know that there is a difference, in our brains in terms of if you are born, and I want to be very careful with, in terms of gender, but if you are born with ovaries and a uterus, you've got a different brain to that of a male in terms of the neuroendocrine system. So I think the way that we use precision medicine when it comes to patient advocacy, I think it shouldn't be a one-size-fits-all approach. It upsets me that even, the first studies that were done on the sex differences in brains was done in like 1850, and we still hold true those notions. Like we're going to space, and we still can't understand the difference between male and female brains. I think that is something that I would love. After I get this done, maybe I'll go through and start researching the sex differences in male and females, because male and female are inherently different in that aspect. So that's another thing I've changed my mind on.
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting. I do think that there's a lot of work to be done in so many areas, but absolutely there are differences, I think, in genders, and we'll see how that plays out over time. I mean, you'll interview Dr. Mosconi, and I think that'll be really useful. Yeah. But there's a lot of data in terms of like how hormones affect our brains. And obviously we have different levels of hormones, but every hormone in terms of male and female, but those hormones are very valuable for both. So for men, estrogen is important, and for women, testosterone is important. And people don't really realize how valuable that is. And
people don't realize that everything is everything, meaning that it's not just about these structural components, these receptors in the brain of estrogen and testosterone. It is what is estrogen doing, or what is the lack of estrogen doing, and what is it doing on your mood and your cognition, and then what is that then doing on the choices that you make every day to either go to the gym or not go to the gym. For me, it's, during the menstrual cycle, sometimes I just can't go to the gym, and so that then it's not just estrogen and it is like, what happens after that?
And
what
it's
are
very
they responsible
individual,
for?
right? Like there's some people who don't notice a difference with their cycle, and there's some people who do. And there's, it's like, how hormone sensitive are you? We're not looking at the receptors.
There you go.
You're not looking at how many receptors are getting activated and how sensitive those receptors are. I mean, it goes down to a very deep level. So I always tell my patients, like, it doesn't matter what your numbers are. I mean, we look at them, we monitor them because they're important to see that we're headed in the right direction. But what matters to me is how you feel, because I can't test receptors you have. I can't test how sensitive they are to the amount of testosterone or the amount of hormones you're getting. And so I think it's really important to realize that every person is individual.
Yeah. And just as a closing out on that, it's also about when you advocate for women's rights, it's advocating for women to come forward and be able to trust their physician and have a really good doctor-patient relationship where they can be completely honest with how they're feeling. I lost my grandmother and my auntie both in the matter of like 2 weeks from cancer, and my mum and I talk about it often. Two women who just never told us how they were feeling.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah, and it's devastating. Like you never knew, and I remember asking. I said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I didn't want to bother anyone.
Mm-hmm. It's a very. But
I would never hear a male. Well, I haven't. No, sorry, I shouldn't say that. I haven't heard any of my grandfather ever say that.
I think it's different. I mean, I think men tend to bottle up a lot of things. I mean, I work with a lot of male patients. They don't share necessarily always, but it's just, I think it's in human nature to sometimes not want to burden others. But certainly, I think in terms of women, we're so busy taking care of others that we often don't take care of ourselves. Whereas for men, I think it's that they feel like they need to be masculine and they don't share things. And so it happens for different reasons potentially that are cultural. But I think it's still in both genders. It does happen.
Yeah.
I know your company works with elite athletes and high performing individuals. So let's talk about either you want your kid to train to become an athlete, or you yourself are a high performing individual, like a surgeon. Like for me, I need to go to work I need to operate on people and I need to be at the top of my game. So what are additional things that someone who is like really high performing, or you're trying to at a young age get your kids to sort of become high performing, what do you do?
Set goals and routines. If you have a goal that you're working towards, it can, and you really pinpoint on that goal and you work towards it and you've reversed engineered it, you can put structure around that goal to achieve it. That's what I see a lot of these athletes doing. They know exactly what they want and they get about doing it absolutely every single day. So that's one behavioral aspect to it. The second one is physiological. If you do want to be high performing, you have to get your physiology in order. Physiology first. I believe it's physiology before behavior, meaning you have to be sleeping, you have to be eating well, you have to be performing every single day. So looking at behavioral characteristics of what makes a high performer, it's the habits, it's the rituals, it's the structure, and it's not veering off path from that. As hard as that sounds.
In terms of goal setting, I mean, that's kind of part of neuroplasticity too, right? You're setting a goal and you're setting out to achieve that goal and making a map with which to achieve that goal, essentially.
Correct. And you're opening that dopamine loop. The circuit opens. And if you set that goal and you achieve little milestones towards that goal, that dopamine is going to keep feeding you and you're going to keep going and going. This is why I was a triathlete, which fed into my entire career. I raced, internationally for Australia, and I had a really good coach, and he was the one that I didn't have the ability back then. I was young. I was a teenager. I didn't have the ability to set my own goals. So he set them for me and he benchmarked me. And I used to want to I wanted to go faster. And he said, no. He never spoke to me about dopamine. He probably even didn't know what that was. But if I had gone out and tried to achieve my own goals, I probably would have just failed and not done it. So it's about how do you goal set? How do you achieve those small milestones? How do you reward yourself with dopamine that keeps telling you to keep going? And you just keep going on that path and try as hard as you can, no matter what age you are. But I'm speaking more so for adolescents, teenagers. Try to limit the amount of social media you have. I see it changing brains, and their brains aren't developed yet.
Yeah.
So that's, yeah.
Yeah, so I think with kids, set their goals, help them set their goals.
Yeah,
help
absolutely.
Them set their goals. I think I'm raising 2 kids, so I often think about, how can I get them to find that ambition, but also I think setting like smaller goals is really helpful, because if you say, hey, I want you to get a scholarship, let's say, for example, parents want these things for their kids, right? I want you to get a scholarship. That's like such a lofty goal, and it's like 10 years away, right? Correct. So it's like, how do you get there? Like how do you get it? As you mentioned, reverse engineer, like what do I need to do right now to get there? And that can be even, again, for your brain health. What can I do right now to prevent Alzheimer's or to prevent dementia later on? I'm reverse engineering the brain I want to have, right?
Yeah. And remember, the best form of exercise is the one that you stick to. So if you do love, this is for kids as well, get them just, what do you love? First and foremost, you can beat anything these days just due to social media. So there's got to be a passion in there, because that passion is going to drive you every day to keep wanting to do it. So once you find that passion, even like with your exercise, with your sleep, gamify it if you have to. And that's what's going to make you stick to it.
Yeah, I think finding the passion is key. You can't force your kid to do something. And I've sort of let my children figure that out for themselves. And when they start showing me signs that they are really into something, we lean into that. But we try not to like put our own desires. Like, Like, I would love it if they were like, professional North Indian dancers. But like, that's not going to happen. So that's okay.
Yeah.
I wanted to talk just briefly before we close out is like, happiness. So in terms of how your brain and happiness are connected from a neurophysiologic perspective.
Yeah, that's such a good question, because I was actually speaking about this yesterday in terms of sleep, right? There's really great studies that show that, people with even mild depression have trouble sleeping. And that's because generally when you think about sleep, we know that serotonin helps us fall asleep and melatonin helps us stay asleep. So there's a strong component there of happiness. But happiness really is, if you think about, when I think about food is not food. Food is information, right? So if you feed so I think about happiness not as like, let's walk outside. Like, happiness is what your brain is telling you, and that's being projected in your physiology. So what are you feeding your brain to help it release certain neurochemicals to tell you that we are happy? Happy is just a word to describe a set of neurochemicals that are released. So are we eating a diet-rich food that is, full of tryptophan, precursor to serotonin, which ends up coming from a turkey, for example? Do we have any stresses in our life from a micronutrient perspective that is signaling to the brain, I am a bit under stress right now, so I'm going to lower everything that doesn't need to be there, such as happiness? Does my brain see a perceived threat? I'm evidently not going to be happy about that, so I'm going to lower happiness. So I see it that way. And I also see that, this is from Chris Palmer's book, if you are in an energy crisis in your brain, low energy levels, you cannot think in any way that you are going to just wake up and be happy. Happiness is something that is deliberate. You cannot, and this is I've seen this in studies, but this is also my opinion. You cannot just wake up and be happy. You have to put the work in every day to make yourself happy, because your brain is just there. You are feeding your brain information, and it is feeding it back to you. And so you have to feed it information that is going to give you the happiness that you want. Yeah.
That's really powerful.
Yeah.
It's in our control.
It's in our control.
So we end our podcast with a few questions, and these can be about you individually or about your work. Well, the first question can't be about your work. So the first question is, if tomorrow you lost all your abilities to coach or to do all your training, and you couldn't be an athlete either, because that was something you've done in the past, what would you do?
Oh, I always say that if I wasn't doing what I was doing, I would actually go to space.
Yeah?
Yeah.
So cool.
I don't know why. I had this very big fear of planes, and I fly a lot. So to overcome that, I started to learn about aviation. I was a math major, my master's in mathematics. So I do love math and engineering. And then I thought, imagine how amazing it would be to go to space. And so I started investigating. I was like, okay, I would go out of my way and do that, I think.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Maybe someday you will.
We'll see.
What's a life hack or health hack that you haven't shared yet that you would share?
Oh, gosh. One thing that I'm trying to do now is implement a walk for 1 hour a day without any electronics.
That's a good one.
Oh, have you ever tried it?
I not an hour. I've done like 10, 15, 20 minutes, 30 minutes maybe, but not an hour. Yeah, I leave my house now with nothing, not even I've got my watch at home, and I go. I guess it's safe in New York to do that. I know, right? There's a lot of people around. I mean, it's safe here too, but I think if you live in like a small town, maybe it depends. Yeah. What's a non-negotiable, something like that you do every day, no matter whether you're traveling, whether you're, wherever you are in the world? Exercise. I mentioned to you, today is so bad for me. I've had minimal 4 hours. I still went to the gym because I know that the sheer forcing of blood to my brain is going to actually outweigh the effects of sleep deprivation. So when you're tired, when you're sleep deprived, what do you focus on? How do you do you do both aerobic and resistance, or do you focus on something in particular? I go high intensity because I'm trying to get as much blood, oxygen rich, just to my brain as I can, and I focus on breathing. Okay. Yeah. And what's something you know now that you wish you knew earlier? Oh, that the power of the people that you get your advice from. I used to take advice from anyone, really. Anyone who was going to give it to me, in your 20s, and I was so hungry. I always wanted to be amazing and really great at so I just took advice from anyone, even relationship advice from, my single friends. We've all done that, unfortunately. Even to this day, I've got friends who are not married or don't run a business who give me advice. And I think to myself,
So now I'm very vigilant in who I ask advice from.
I think that comes with age and maturity, right? I think that's good. Louisa, it was so wonderful to have you. Where can my audience find you?
You can follow me on Instagram, Louisa Nicola _. I also now have YouTube, which is just Louisa Nicola. And then you can check out the Neuroathletics website for everything else.
That's amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you guys so much for listening to today's episode of the Rena Malik MD podcast. If you like this episode, please do me a solid and share this podcast with your friends and family. It would mean the world to me. Take a screenshot and share it on social media and tag me. I love seeing it. And of course, this is the best way that we can have our content reach people around the world. And as always, remember to take care of yourself because you're worth it.